Helene Costello was a child star in the 19-teens who eventually became a grown-up star of the silents in the 1920s. But after a successful transition to starring in the talkies in 1928, she only made a few more films before more or less retiring after 1935. Why? Join me as I investigate. I must first thank Terry Chester Schulman, whose book Film's First Family, The Untold Story of the Costellos, proved to be an invaluable resource in researching Helene. Please order a copy on Amazon today. Helene Costello was born in 1906 in New York to legendary stage and screen actors Maurice and May Costello. Maurice had been in vaudeville as early as the 1890s and became one of the first major movie stars of the early silent era. In 1912, he was the top money-making star in Hollywood and was the #1 male star in Hollywood before even Francis X. Bushman was. May had also begun on the stage and followed her husband into the movies, making a name for herself, often billed as Mrs. Costello. The couple's elder daughter, Dolores, was born in 1903. It came as no surprise that young Helene and Dolores both began acting in motion pictures as early as 1909. Helene made a debut playing a bit part at the age of 3 in her father's production of Les Miserables, followed by both sisters appearing as young fairies that support Florence Turner's Titania in A Midsummer Night's Dream later that year. Helene, impressively, is a joy to watch on the screen even at such a young age. Her career was off to a great start, and 2 years later, at the age of 5, she played her first leading role in 1911's Her Crowning Glory, as the impish daughter of John Bunny that requires a new governess to mind her after driving her nurse, played by her mother May, crazy, only to see that the governess, who is played by Flora Finch, and her father find romance. Several supporting roles followed in 1911 and 1912, including a small part in Helen Gardner's feature-length production of Cleopatra in 1912, before she starred in The Night Before Christmas, Two Women and Two Men, and Fellow Voyagers, which also starred her father and sister. All of Helene's films in this time period were made at Vitagraph. Helene continued to make leading and supporting appearances in a number of Vitagraph shorts until 1916, when she starred as the lead in Billy's Mother, which got her a significant amount of press in moving picture world. At the age of 10, Helene had made close to 70 films, and just a year earlier than that, she had been named the most popular child actress in a poll. But 1916 marked the beginning of many lean years for the Costello family. According to Schulman, Maurice had several issues at Vitagraph, which stemmed from his behavior on and off the set that was probably linked to his drinking problem. He was eventually fired by Vitagraph and was absent from movie magazines for months before attempting to recreate his career at other studios and on the stage. I'm assuming both Helene and Dolores were also released from their Vitagraph contracts, which led to Helene going back to school, a boarding school. Maurice was traveling around the country trying to find work and money, leaving teenage Dolores having to go to work to support the family, whose finances were quickly moving towards bankruptcy. Dolores found work as a model. Eventually, Helene left school and had to work as well. Independently of their father, both girls auditioned for George White to be part of his George White Scandal in 1923 on Broadway and were cast, Dolores as a showgirl and Helene as a dancer and the understudy to leading female Winnie Leitner. The show was a smash hit. Helene and Dolores remained with it for a year on Broadway before joining the national tour. Although their father was still struggling to make a comeback as an actor, Dolores and Helene were a hit in the biggest musical in America, and their luck would only continue to grow. In 1925, Dolores was spotted by Warner Brothers scout and signed to a contract leading to Hollywood with Helene in tow. Helene was also given a contract, and their mother, who had been their chaperone in the scandals, went along as well, also working as their manager. Interestingly enough, it appears that Helene found success as an adult star a little faster than her sister, although both began in bit-part appearances. Helene first starred as the female lead in the western Ranger of the Big Pines opposite Kenneth Harlan. She then starred in The Love Toy with her future husband, Lowell Sherman. She was then loaned to Paramount to star with Raymond Griffith in Wet Paint, which got her good notice in motion picture news. Helene then returned to Warner Brothers to make a cameo appearance as Mary Astor's maid in Don Juan, which starred John Barrymore, who coincidentally would become her brother-in-law in a few years. According to Schulman, Dolores and Barrymore were already an item at this time. Helene next played supporting roles in both The Honeymoon Express, which also featured Virginia Lee Corbin, and Millionaires, which starred George Sidney and Louise Fazenda. Also in 1926, Maurice returned to live with the Costello family and it was Helene that chose to take care of him and get him back on his feet despite all of his past deeds. Helene was then a lead again opposite dog star Rin Tin Tin in While London Sleeps, which got decent notices in motion picture news. In 1927, Helene starred alongside Sid Chaplin in The Fortune Hunter, with Variety stating that she was vivid, but essentially the role was beneath her talents. That year, she also starred alongside Dolores for the first time since their childhood in The Heart of Maryland. She then starred in her first top-billed film, Good Time Charlie, with Warner Oland and Clyde Cook. Then she was loaned to MGM to star opposite James Murray in Old Kentucky, with Variety again commenting that her talents were wasted in a role that only really required her to be pretty on the screen. It's unfortunate that studios weren't finding a proper vehicle for Helene's considerable abilities. Although she got a starring role first, it was Dolores that had been launched into superstardom soon before this, almost overnight after she began starring alongside her boyfriend and later husband, John Barrymore. Although I think Dolores would have made it there even without his assistance, which she proved by remaining a star long after their divorce. Motion Picture Magazine even published an article in 1926 discussing Dolores' rise to stardom in contrast to calling Helene the quote-unquote unknown sister. Despite not being a big a star as her sister, Helene still progressed in a career that Shulman referred to as slow and steady. She was popular enough to be named Wampus Baby Star in 1927 and also that year married her first husband, Jack Regan. But her next starring role in Husbands for Rent saw her, according to Motion Picture News, as miscast in a comedic vamp role. In 1928, she headlined the silent Comrades, which got her good mention in Motion Picture News, and also was loaned to Ray Art to star in The Phantom of the Turf. But it was her next film in 1928 which saw Helene make history and finally found her a suitable vehicle for her talents. Warner Brothers had become the first studio to have spoken dialogue on film in 1927, and Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer using Vitaphone technology. By summer of 1928, the studio was ready to release an entire film with spoken dialogue, aka the first full-length talkie. The film, Lights of New York, was headlined by Helene, Colin Landis, and Gladys Brockwell. Helene played Kitty Lewis, a nightclub performer in love with a barber-turned-bootlegger played by Landis. She even got to show off her dancing skills. The film was a massive smash hit, the 9th biggest commercial hit of the year, as the audience came in droves to see an all-talking picture. Unfortunately, aside from Gladys Brockwell, the acting was received poorly. Variety and Film Daily both criticized Helene's voice, but Shulman provides an explanation with which I agree. The critics were destined to hate it because most in the film business feared the rise of the talkies as an end of an art form and therefore their careers. Second, the technology was so new that the microphones did not record the voices very well. Also, Vitaphone technology recorded their voices separately from the film, and their voices were played on a record with a record player while the movie was playing on the screen. Third, the actors were destined to not speak their best and give their best performances since they were literally physically stuck in one place most of the time, asked to not move and make any extra noise that could be picked up by the microphones, which were often inches above their heads. It also didn't make any sense for the critics to state that Helene did not have a good voice, as she had grown up on the stage and made an impression on Broadway. I think they were so set to hate the film that they would have criticized anyone's voice. Shulman also points out that the film was made so quickly that Helene barely had any time to rehearse, and they didn't even correct any times actors flubbed lines. While the film was a hit, it sadly didn't do much to help Helene's career. While Dolores' stardom continued to rise after her talkies, Helene's was stalled. After the partial talkie in Midnight Taxi in 1928, Warner Brothers dropped Helene. She moved on to star at various Poverty Row studios. In 1929, she starred in the silent When Dreams Come True at Ray Art and the silent serial The Fatal Warning at Mascot, but neither helped her career very much, especially since they were both silent at a time when talkies were becoming the norm. Warner Brothers did invite her back to appear alongside Dolores in the My Sister number of their talkie musical extravaganza Show of Shows. Helene and Dolores headlined the number and demonstrated their considerable singing and dancing abilities before being joined by other famous screen sisters. After this film, Helene decided to take some time off. By 1929, she had divorced Jack Regan and married former co-star Lowell Sherman, but their marriage was doomed by several problems that unfortunately garnered Helene a considerable amount of negative press amidst a very public divorce in 1932. Lowell claimed that Helene had a drinking problem, which she and Dolores denied. After their divorce, Helene then married Cuban producer Arturo del Barrio. In 1935, Helene briefly returned to the motion picture industry. She had small roles in Public Hero No. 1 and Honeymoon Limited before signing with MGM to support Jean Harlow in Riff Raff. Although she was memorable as one of Jean's friends in prison, she only appeared on the screen for a few minutes. Helene then left films again, and by 1939 was divorced from Del Barrio. Unfortunately, her personal problems continued to grow. It appears that she did inherit her father's alcoholism and was arrested for a DUI, which sadly made it to the papers. She did marry for the fourth time in 1940 to artist George LeBlanc and found happiness when she gave birth to their daughter Deidre in 1941. But this marriage sadly also proved to be rocky. LeBlanc was in the service in World War II, and while he was away, Helene had several health problems which could have been further struggles with alcohol, drugs, or both. She declared bankruptcy and checked into treatment, leaving Deidre with Dolores for over 2 years. When LeBlanc returned from overseas, he filed for divorce and sued Helene for custody of Deidre, which he was awarded in 1948. Sadly, Helene's life continued to spiral downward. Her father, virtually penniless, died in 1951, leaving each daughter only $1 in his will. Their mother, May, had died in 1929, relatively young, after suffering from heart disease. Helene's addictions continued to become worse. In 1957, she checked in the Patton State Hospital in San Bernardino under an assumed name for narcotics addiction. Sadly, while there, she passed away just 2 days later from pneumonia, being only 50 years old. Helene's death was one of the biggest tragedies of old Hollywood. Like Virginia Lee Corbin, she was thrust into the limelight at a young age and never really given the chance to have a real childhood. At the age of 10, she was briefly allowed to be a normal kid and go to school, but had to leave while still a teenager to begin to work to help her older sister support their family due to their father's alcoholism and philandering. Briefly finding success at Warner Brothers, Helene was set on the path to become a huge star, getting there before her sister. But as well as the studio had handled Dolores' career, they had equally miserably mishandled Helene's. Not knowing what a talent they had on their hands, they wasted her in poorly written comedies. When she finally got a chance to showcase her talent and make history as the star of the first feature-length all-talking film, the material was so weak and the technology was so new that no amount of powerful acting could have saved any performer in it. Being the leading heroine of Lights of New York essentially made Helene the scapegoat for its shortcomings, even though she did the best she could do with the character and the material. Although the film made money for the studio, they blamed her for its lack of critical praise and dropped her, which was a big mistake for many reasons. First, it showed that they had continued to mismanage her career by failing to find an appropriate talkie vehicle for her. Second, how could they not know the talent they had on their hands in the form of Helene? Just a year later, they allowed her to sing and dance in shows, and she completely stole it, lighting up the screen and honestly outshining her most famous sister. It was foolish of Warner Brothers not to invite Helene back and showcase her song and dance abilities in a series of musicals. She could have easily been a lead in their Gold Diggers of Broadway in 1929 and then gone on to star in subsequent musical hits. But the studio never gave her that chance. Unfortunately, she had inherited her father's inclination to addiction and lacked the strength to rise above it, and the strength to rise above dire circumstances like Dolores had. So she moved from one unhappy marriage to another, trying to find the love she so desperately craved, and failing to do so, continued to crumble and sink further into her disease, which she sadly was not strong enough to beat. Like so many others, Helene was a true victim of the Hollywood studio system and deserved better. Fortunately, we do have a few of Helene's performances still available to enjoy. I suggest checking out Lights of New York on YouTube. It deserves a critical reassessment, and I think you will find her performance pleasing even with the rather weak material. I also cannot recommend watching her in The Show of Shows enough, as she is just a treasure to watch. Both her and Dolores are a treasure to watch, but Helene just has that extra sparkle and seems so comfortable and ready to be a musical star on the screen. And while you're at it, please tell a good friend about Helene Costello and her beautiful talent. Let's try to make her name a little more well-known so that she can rightfully take her deserved place among the names of the greatest stars in Hollywood history. Please like and subscribe or follow this account if you want to learn more about the history of silent film stars whose stardom lasted only briefly in the talkies. Up next, join me as I cover the silent to talkie career of Catherine Crawford. Thank you so much for joining me. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.